Hi, welcome to this talk on ecosystem health and how it's connected to human health. So this is going to be a quick and very brief look at how it is that biodiversity and connectants are connected to the health of humans, and it's by myself and Dr. Tom Barker. So first, let's start off by considering what we mean by ecosystem health. So lots of researchers agree that a healthy ecosystem is one that is productive and functioning. And we'll talk more about functioning in a bit. So productive, it's creating biomass, it's growing, it has vigour. It is also one that has an appropriate structure. So it might be a physical structure, it might have a high degree of biodiversity, and the organisms within it will have different roles. So they'll have different functions, different jobs, different niches within that ecosystem. A healthy ecosystem is also one that is free of disease and exotics. And finally, it's an ecosystem that is resilient. And resilience is quite a complicated idea, and it's not saying that an ecosystem won't change, it's saying that it is able to adapt to things like climate change, for example. So a resilient ecosystem tends to be one that has all of the above. So a resilient ecosystem is one that is vigorous, productive, high in biodiversity, with lots of internal connections and free of disease. And just a reminder that ecosystems are really connected. So they're not standalone. Organisms may have jobs and niches, but they're all interacting with each other. So this is just a very simplified ecosystem on the right. This is just a patch of soil, and it's showing you how that soil is processed through invertebrates, which in turn feed other invertebrates, which in turn breaks the soil down into smaller particles, which feed bacteria and fungi, which in turn feed back into those larger invertebrates and create soil. And that ecosystem in turn is supported by organic matter that might come in from outside, from water, and from light energy through photosynthesis. So why is biodiversity important? Well, essentially biodiversity is needed for an ecosystem to function. So ecosystem functioning could include the sequestration of carbon, the ability of an ecosystem to hold water, have a high diversity of predators that would feed on agricultural pests, pollinators. So in order for an ecosystem to provide those sorts of functions, those sorts of services, you need a certain degree of biodiversity. And the diagram on the left is a sort of conceptual way of showing that. So if you imagine each circle is a species, and those species are performing a sequence of jobs, of functions, then in this top picture, there are insufficient number of species for that function to happen. You could think of it as being, for example, soil formation. So if you imagine there's a group of species that can break down organic matter into smaller particles, into yet smaller particles, mix it together and soil is formed. So in that top picture, there aren't quite enough species there, each with a different function to do that job. The next level down shows you that same system again, but now it's more biodiverse. There's a greater number of species. So there's a greater chance that all the functions, all the needs are filled. So you may have invertebrates with different sized mouth parts breaking down the soil into smaller and smaller particles suitable for microbes. It's then mixed by other organisms, and therefore you have a good healthy soil. And the final diagram down shows you the same again, but now with lots of species, so many so that they have overlapping functions. And sometimes in the literature it's described as being functional redundancy. And of course that's pretty unlikely. It's likely that all these species have a subtly different role or work in slightly different ways in different types of environment. But this last one does provide us with resilience. So if a species was to become extinct, the function, in this case soil formation, can still happen effectively because you've got so many species carrying out similar functions. And then the picture on the right again is showing us about the connectants, because when you have a species, when you have an ecosystem rather, with lots of different species, you then have more interactions. So this is a generalised food web, and you can see primary producers at the bottom. You've got detritus, so organic matter. You've got diatoms, which is a type of alga, filamentous algae, etc. along the bottom. And they are providing food further up the food chain to consumers, further up again to predators, until you get to the top with the pike and the heron. So here is quite diverse. The pike is feeding from at least 3 different groups, 3 different organisms, and as such, the existence of the pike is relatively safe. I'm afraid dragonflies often go extinct locally. They're very sensitive to water quality and changes in habitat, and that's what's happened now. So now the pike is only reliant on 2 different foods, and in turn the heron's survival is also a little bit more tentative. So in this more simple food web now, you can see it is less resilient. So the overall take-home point from this slide is more species increases ecosystem functioning and also increases resilience of that ecosystem to adapt and to survive different changes. And I love this slide. This is a picture, a diagram of the sequenced genomes from a range of organisms that we know exist. And this was published in Nature in 2016. And the real message from this slide is that most life is prokaryotic. So most life is small microbes, bacteria. So when we're thinking about biodiversity and the role of ecosystems in providing different functions, and this includes obviously aquatic environments, that most of the life that we are talking about is actually microbial. And we don't know what it all does and how important it all is, but it's been around on the earth for millennia, and it's certainly much more diverse and much more ancient than us lot down here. So here we are with the prokaryotes, humans lumped in with other animals, plants, algae and fungi. So we make up, and by we, I'm lumping ourselves in with algae and fungi here, we down here, the eukaryotes, are much less diverse than all the prokaryotic organisms. And the picture on the right is my favourite prokaryote, which is a blue-green alga. So lots of diversity is important, connectivity is important, and this is a really useful slide to show us that connectivity goes beyond that ecosystem. We have a tendency to see ecosystems as very distinct. Well, there's a tropical forest ecosystem, there's a sand dune ecosystem, there's a marine environment, there's a coastal ecosystem. And this paper here, produced in 2006, gave a great example of how aquatic, terrestrial systems are all linked. So it tells the story really of salmon. So we have salmon migrating from the oceans, looking at arrow A, and they're coming up the rivers into the deep continents right inland. And as they come in, they're bringing with them all that energy and all that protein that they've gathered out to sea while feeding. I'm afraid when they go up the rivers, they then meet their ends. They die of natural causes and rot, or they get eaten by predators such as the brown bear here. So arrows B, C and D show what happens when the bear feeds. It produces bear feces, drop bits of carcasses and nutrients onto the land. In addition, the carcasses of the salmon that have died within the streams, they're broken down by microbes within the rivers, and that fertilises the water, which is then flowing through that hyporheic zone into the area where the roots are of the forest and fertilising the forest. So really you have a net flow then of nutrients and organic matter from the freshwater environment into the terrestrial environment and promoting all that growth of those of that temperate and high altitude or high latitude forests rather. That in turn is also then supporting the freshwater environment. So those trees will shed leaves, large woody debris, which goes back into the river, which supports aquatic life again. So you have a brilliant example there of the oceans and what is happening in the oceans influencing the flow of nutrients and energy into the fresh waters, and that influence going right inland, right into the depths of continents. So it's a great example, and it reminds us that this happens everywhere, that all ecosystems are connected and that all ecosystems are reliant on each other with flows of energy and nutrients. And as humans, we find that very hard to often perceive. And when we're planning how to manage ecosystems, it's very hard to understand those complex connections. But of course we need to understand it, because when we lose diversity and we lose connectivity, that has very important impacts on human health, and these are well documented. So this is as much a summary as anything else, a very quick run through examples. Loss of global primary productivity we know is leading to climate change. The biomass, the diversity of green plants on Earth in particular, and in aquatic systems, is insufficient to hold on to carbon for the long term. We know that the drainage of wetlands releases greenhouse gases. We know that when we lose coastal mangroves, when we devegetate catchments, when we disconnect floodplains from their rivers, that makes the environment worse. We're more likely to flood, we're more likely to suffer physical damage, loss to property, but also high degrees of stress. It's mentally very stressful to live in the threat of flooding. We know that our food security is reliant on healthy ecosystems which formulate soils, a variety of microbes and fungi all interacting together. There's evidence that where ecosystems have been simplified, there has been a rise of diseases, for example malaria, and more there's interest in how our well-being benefits from being connected with nature, and a diverse nature at that. But that's not to say there are not some disservices. So in some parts of the world, draining wetlands has been used as a means to combat malaria, to reduce the places that the malaria can spread. And we also very recently have seen examples where zoonotic diseases, those carried by animals, has jumped from animals into humans, particularly when we've sort of gone into their environment. And this has been especially so, in the last few years when we've seen the COVID pandemic. And there's a growing body of evidence to show that COVID pandemic has been linked to our use of forests, tropical forests, going in there for the resources, and in doing so coming into close contact with a whole range of different species, some of which are known to carry SARS, COVID-like viruses. So it's likely that the COVID virus has made that jump from different organisms into humans. If you read the World Health Organization report, you can see it is actually very complicated to know exactly where it came from, made more so by the fact that obviously markets and supply chains going into China come from all over the world. But certainly the evidence is there that there's a reservoir of SARS type of viruses, and they have probably made the leap into humans. And that's been driven by us going into the tropical forest where these animals are and interacting with them much more closely. So yeah, it's a very clear and very contemporary example of the impacts of loss of biodiversity in ecosystems on human health. So what are the solutions then? And again, these are massive. So just very quickly, just to flag some ideas. Restoration of ecosystems, in particular their biomass. A small ecosystem cannot support as much as a small ecosystem cannot support as much as a huge biomass, large ecosystem. We need diversity in that ecosystems for ecosystem services to be carried out. And in the UK we've seen that. We've seen our simplified ecosystems, our intensive agriculture having an impact on insects. So if you want to look at the cartoon on the right, massive decline of insects in recent years. It's not just restoring the biomass, the diversity of ecosystems, but also we can target the reintroduction of predators. There is evidence out there that where you introduce predators to manage an ecosystem and a habitat, that can reduce disease vectors. It's likely that one of the underlying causes of biodiversity loss is our lack of ability to value ecosystems. It may be that future developments are needed in valuing ecosystems economically. And I've just put in a little picture at the top there, which is the economics of biodiversity. So that's the TEEB project, which looked at ways to put a value, a market value, on these things. We also know that keeping people out of ecosystems, having barrier conservation, is ineffective. So if you keep people out and you basically put up a big fence, then it can just move the resource use, the hunting, the deforestation to areas outside the reserve. And we see that with marine protected areas where overfishing has become more intense outside of marine protected areas. But probably most importantly, we need much more research to look at the links between ecosystem and human health. Because if we can show those links and explain them to policymakers, then clearly the role of ecosystems, the role of biodiversity and the impact of human health will be much better understood and will make their way into legislation. Thank you. So I've just got a list of references at the back, and we should be happy to take any questions.